Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. I hope you're all doing well. Today, we're going to cover all of the best spells in Baldur's Gate 3. Over the last several weeks, I have gone over in extensive detail every single spell in Baldur's Gate and rated them in tier lists, one for each level. And that has yielded almost 10 hours of videos on the spells. So when I say extensive detail, I mean quite extensive detail. Today, what we're going to do is synthesize that and talk about all of the best spells, all the spells that ended up in S and A tier at each level, why those spells are so good, and what you should use them for when you're playing the game, and also how to choose between them, and when you should pick spells from lower tiers. I'll mention all of the S and A tier spells, and also some notable ones from lower tiers, to give you a one-stop shop for spell selection to allow you to make sure that all of your spellcasters are operating at maximum efficiency. If you've already seen all of those tier lists, don't worry, there will still be a lot of new information in this video, because I intend to also talk a lot about sort of general principles for how you select spells and how you choose which ones to cast when you're actually operating your characters, as well as when it's better to cast leveled up versions of lower level spells to upcast a spell rather than use a spell of that spell level. Every high level spell in the game, and you'll see this as we go through the tiers, that there are fewer and fewer good S and A tier spells as we get to the higher levels, because every higher level spell is not only competing with spells of its level, but also every single spell of a lower level, because you can always cast it with a higher level spell slot. So knowing when to do that and when to actually cast leveled up spells is very important. We'll be talking about that as well. Before we begin, I will quickly go over one general sort of play assumption that I'm making, as well as how I've defined these tiers very quickly. So in general, I will be rating the spells both on their power level and on their efficiency if you aren't long resting after every combat. If you are long resting after every single combat, which is possible to recover your spell slots, and that's certainly something you can do in Baldur's Gate, there's enough camp supplies that you can definitely long rest after every fight. Then spells that have like long-term buffs throughout the day, or spells that produce a summon that can last you for several fights, will have lower efficiency if you're using that playstyle. I am assuming that you want to conserve spell slots because you're not long resting after every fight, and so I'm also rating these spells based on their efficiency as well as just their raw power whenever they're cast. For the tiers, I went with S tier spells are ones that basically every character that has access to these spells is always going to take. A tier spells are ones that are sort of mainstays of that character archetype and are spells that you are going to build your character specifically to get access to these spells because they're that good. They'll usually be ones that you will cast almost every combat encounter or almost every day, and are going to, generally speaking, be these two tiers will be the most common actions that your spellcasters will take throughout the day. Of course, the lower level spells will also see some use, and I will mention particularly noteworthy ones as we go through. And I also do want to say, if you don't see your favorite spell in the highest tiers, don't worry. No spells in the game, I think, are completely useless, or almost no spells, and all of the spells can be used very well. And also, the optimum spell to take, the absolutely optimal spell to take, is the one that you have the most fun with. So don't be too concerned if your favorite spell doesn't show up in this list, because you can still absolutely make viable builds with the lower tier spells, and the spell that you should cast is the one that you should have most fun with. As always, optimization is a tool, and you should use this to empower you to be able to do the things that you want to do, not to constrain you into optimizing your spells within a certain narrow selection. Always prioritize your fun, because it's a video game and you should have fun. Finally, for detailed discussion of what these spells do and each of the spells, as well as all the spells in the lower tiers, you can of course refer to my previous tier lists. I'll link them in the description, where I have gone into extensive detail about each spell. And if you want level by level guides for individual classes, then of course you can check any of my character guides for those classes, where I go over spell selection level by level. Alright, let's jump in and talk about the spells. We'll start with cantrips, which I think are actually highly underrated in most build guides, which don't spend a lot of time making sure that you have selected the right ones. But which cantrips you select is probably the most important decision any spellcaster character is going to make when building the character for their impact throughout the entire game. Cantrips, you begin the game with them, and they're always available to your character. So the cantrips that you select are almost certainly going to be the spells you cast the most often throughout the entire game, and in fact will almost certainly be the most common action that your character takes throughout the entire game by themselves. So it's going to have a massive impact on how efficient your spellcasters are, whether you have the right cantrips or not. Cantrips come in basically two types. There are damage cantrips, which do some damage and usually have a mild amount of utility attached to them, and utility cantrips, which don't do damage but have a significant impact on sort of out-of-combat utility, whether that be to help defend your character, move enemies around, do something in conversation, or so on. Generally speaking, your characters, your mages are going to want to have one damage cantrip and the rest of your slots filled out with utility, although some multi-class builds that get lots of cantrips may want multiple damage cantrips. The reason for this is that you usually don't need to vary which cantrips you're casting which damage cantrip you're casting during a fight, so once you've selected the best one, you don't need any other ones. That said, I would recommend when you are choosing between two cantrips that are roughly equal in value, varying them across your different party members so that you have access to different elemental damage types and different utility. But within a character, the likelihood that you're going to need to switch elemental damage on your cantrip is low. If you come up against an enemy that resists your main cantrip, just cast a higher level spell using a different elemental type. This isn't going to be something that you will need access to multiple different damage cantrips to overcome significantly. I always get people mad about that in the comments when I say that, but in general, you will not need more than one damage cantrip per character, so we need to make sure to select the right one. The right one for clerics and druids is almost always Produce Flame, just because it does more damage and has more utility than the other damage cantrips available to those characters. Though it only has 30-foot range, it does d8 damage and can set things on fire, which is extremely useful as utility. As well, it acts as a light spell, as a light source, which is also very good. For wizards and sorcerers, it's a little more complicated because they have to choose between Ray of Frost and Bone Chill, both of which are extremely good. Bone Chill, removing enemy healing, provides a lot of utility in various fights. Ray of Frost, slowing enemies, is incredibly strong, and also it can be doubled using the wet condition. By default, I would recommend just selecting Ray of Frost, but I think that those two cantrips are both excellent damage dealing spells. I think they both beat out Firebolt very slightly, because Firebolt has no added utility. Yes, you can light things on fire, but you can do that from a variety of sources. You don't necessarily need to take a cantrip to be able to light things on fire, whereas being able to freeze water on the ground with Ray of Frost is incredibly useful, and being able to slow enemy movement is incredibly powerful. For warlocks, of course, your damage cantrip is always going to be Eldritch Blast, which is by far the best damage cantrip in the game, since it is force damage, has higher damage than most other cantrips, and makes multiple attacks, meaning it's going to add your damage riders, like the Agonizing Blast Invocation that adds Warlock's Charisma to their Eldritch Blast, multiple times over as you level up. Eldritch Blast, unlike every other cantrip, gains multiple attacks as you level, rather than multiple damage dice as you level, which means that you get to apply the riders multiple times. It also makes it more likely to hit, and it makes it more likely to critical hit. Eldritch Blast is so powerful that it's actually the only cantrip I think you should seriously consider a one-level dip into Warlock for on other charisma-based casters, because it's just that much better than the other damage cantrips. And so if you have another reason to go into Warlock, getting access to Eldritch Blast is incredibly powerful. For the best utility cantrips in the game, we are going to always want Guidance somewhere in our party. I think Guidance may be the single best spell in the game, because it will, over the course of the game, convert dozens of failed skill checks into successes by being a free extra boost to every skill check that you have. I would highly recommend that for most parties you will want 2 characters with access to Guidance, although you will get it from an item. So you usually only need to actually select it on one character, but playing without guidance anywhere in your party is definitely going to make the game much, much harder because you won't pass skill checks nearly as often. The other S tier cantrip here is Minor Illusion, which has about 9,000 uses, maybe even slightly more than that if you want to go with the joke. And those uses include peeling enemies off from their buddies so you can fight them one at a time, grouping enemies for AoE, making merchants turn around so you can steal stuff, or making people turn around so you can steal stuff without them seeing, and turning enemies around so that you can sneak up on them, as well as literally dozens of other potential uses. The creativity with this spell, that the creative strategic options that you have with this spell are immense and nearly limitless, and I would highly recommend that you have it somewhere in your party. Only one character needs this. Usually you don't need it on multiple characters, but you should definitely have access to Minor Illusion somewhere in your party, and you should use it extensively to gain access to surprise rounds, sneak attacks, grouped enemies for AoE spells, and so on. In A tier, under utility spells, I've placed Mage Hand, which has a whole bunch of uses. One is just to absorb a hit. Enemies will attack it, and though it only has 1 HP, that's actually somewhat good for you, and is easily attacked. That's actually somewhat good for you because the AI judges what to attack based on how easy it is for them to hit things often, and so it will often prioritize attacking the Mage Hand, meaning that you can, when you have Mage Hand, once per short rest, trade your action for an enemy action. There's a lot of circumstances where that's very good, and so even by itself, it basically works as like a one-turn stun, which is a very powerful effect if you place it correctly. Even by itself, that would be enough to make this spell excellent. In addition to that, though, it can throw stuff, it can poke enemies for a single point of damage, and throwing stuff is very powerful because amongst the things that it can throw are bombs and potions, and so this can be an extra heal every single turn, or some extra damage every single turn that you have it active in combat, and of course it has all of the out-of-combat utility that you expect from a spell like this, being able to push buttons, set off traps across the map, carry stuff to and from different areas, and so on. The other utility cantrip in A tier is Blade Ward, and this one might look a little bit out of place. Generally speaking, you don't want to use Blade Ward just as a sort of default combat action, because defensive actions are typically worse than offensive actions in Dungeons & Dragons combat in general, and in Baldur's Gate in specific. Proactivity is better than reactivity. However, Blade Ward has a ton of utility. One is if you're taking like multiple attacks in a turn and can't kill those enemies, Blade Ward can sometimes keep your characters alive. Another is to protect temporary hit points that you have from various sources, including things like Armor of Agathis. There are entire builds based around Armor of Agathis damage return combined with Blade Ward, and a third is to combine with other sources of damage reduction to give you a ton of extra damage reduction. If you combine it with, say, the heavy armor that reduces your damage by 2, that multiplies the value of that damage reduction significantly if you're able to cast Blade Ward. It's also very useful if it's basically the only good use of the Eldritch Knight's Warcaster feature, where you can cast a cantrip and then make an attack, because normally, damage cantrips for Eldritch Knight are less efficient than just attacking with their weapons, but this lets you both do damage and get tanky with the Eldritch Knight, and so it's a very useful spell for them as well. Other notable cantrips in this tier include Light, although Produce Flame often will take the place of Light, depending on the circumstances. Firebolt is not a bad damage spell, of course. I just think it's mostly superseded by the ones that I've rated higher. And Friends and Thaumaturgy can both make it much, much easier for you to pass skill checks. Thaumaturgy has no downsides associated with it, and so any charisma character that has access to Thaumaturgy should take it and use it very regularly. Dipping Cleric on bards just to get access to this spell is very useful. And Friends is the same, although you have to, on Tactician or Honor mode, you have to be careful because you may provoke hostility when you use Friends. The best use for Friends, of course, is against the characters that you're going to fight after the persuasion checks anyways, like the Act 2 bosses. And even if you only cast it on them, that's enough value from just this cantrip that it's worth picking up on your party face in general. But, of course, you do have to be careful with this spell. The only other really notable spells in this tier are Vicious Mockery, which is a bard's only damage cantrip, so sometimes worth taking on bards for that reason, and Shillelagh, which is good if you're going to be meleeing as a druid. In particular, use this in combination with a torch to do a ton of extra damage. Alright, that should give you a good guide to which cantrips to select. Let's move on. First level spells. Similar to cantrips, first level spells are with you for the entire game, so they are going to be something that you're going to do over and over and over again throughout the entire game, and are going to be a huge portion of your spellcaster's strength, and one of the more common things that they're going to do. The name of the game here is Control. The first level spells have some of the best controlling effects in the game, and Dungeons & Dragons combat can be thought of as an exercise in reducing the number of relevant actions that your opponents take as much as possible, whether by winning initiative, which is very important, dealing enough damage that they die and therefore can't take actions, or controlling them in some way, whether that be by a hard control effect like command, which just causes them to skip their turn, or a soft control effect that, say, knocks them over and prevents them from moving, and then you can get away from them where they can't do anything. The first level spells give you tons of different options for controlling the battlefield and controlling your enemies, and in particular, the control spells targeting single enemies at first level are incredible and are ones that you're going to use over and over again throughout the game. Because there's so many S and A tier first level spells, rather than trying to group them by like the type of spell that they are, I'm just going to go through them in alphabetical order by tier, and we'll talk about each of them individually very briefly. We'll start with Bless, which is one of the best buffs in the game, and is something that any character who has access to it, your cleric, is going to use their concentration on for most fights in the early game. Up until the mid game, this is what you're going to want to be concentrating on most of the time. The 1d4 bonus doesn't sound like a lot, but it really is. Chromatic Orb is my go-to damage spell for characters that have access to it, because it can be any elemental damage type, and it's also a control spell, because in ice mode it can create an ice surface. In Baldur's Gate, when enemies walk on an ice surface, they fall over. They have a chance of falling over, and if they fall over on their turn, they lose the entire rest of their turn, so it's going to cost them actions. Enemies will usually move before attacking, so this will almost always cost an enemy an action if they fall over on the Chromatic Orb. It also gives you access to every single elemental damage type, so you always have the right damage type. Command is the single best control spell in the game, and is one of the spells that upcasts the best in the entire game. It just gets an extra target for every spell level you cast it, meaning when cast at higher levels, it lets you trade your action for multiple enemies' actions, which is a very efficient trade. It knocks them prone, which is going to slow them on future turns and give you advantage on your attacks against them, and costs them an entire turn as long as they fail the save. An incredibly powerful and efficient effect that you're going to use constantly. When in doubt, one of the best turns you can always take is casting Command with whatever spell slot you need to hit every enemy in the fight, and if you do that, you are going to do very, very well in a lot of different fights. Create Water is a great utility spell because the wet condition in Baldur's Gate doubles lightning and cold damage to enemies, so in combination with any of those effects, it's very powerful. It also gives you resistance to fire damage if you need that, and creates a gigantic puddle of water on the ground, which you can hit with any cold damage to create an ice surface. So Create Water plus Ray of Frost makes a giant ice surface, and therefore is also a control spell. Create Water seems like it's a very unassuming spell, but there are so many powerful uses for this spell that I definitely would recommend taking it. You'll find lots of creative ways to use it. It did receive a nerf in patch 6, but I don't think that changes my evaluation of the spell. Find Familiar gives you a million different options, mostly for scouting and so on, but anything that you can do with any summon, and summons are always good in Baldur's Gate because they last all day, and you can carry them from encounter to encounter. You can block doorways with them, you can restrict enemy movement with them, you can use them to scout, you can use them to set off traps if you need to, and so on. You can do with Find Familiar. This is just a very valuable effect to have access to for any character that can use it. It also will benefit from all of the AoE buffs that you can be applying to your party, and so you can actually give this thing a lot of extra HP and so on, which will let it be an additional let it have a lot of additional use. I recommend taking the Raven because it can blind enemies. Healing Word is a bonus action that allows you to revive a downed ally, preventing them from dying, and also getting them back in the fight so that they can continue to fight. It also lets you, as a bonus action, apply all of the items that apply all of the buffs that items that buff when you heal an ally give you. So those in Baldur's Gate include Bless and Blade Ward. So with a bonus action applying Bless, one of the best buffs in the game, and Blade Ward, the best defensive buff in the game, to an ally is incredibly useful, and you're going to use that very often when an ally's in danger. And also you can use Healing Word to get allies up from the ground if they are downed. Basically every character that has this should always have it prepared. It's a great emergency button. You don't want to use it as your plan A, because healing in combat in general is not a good use of your resources. It just won't keep up with incoming damage because of the numbers, but this is a great emergency button, and this is the best way to heal when you need an emergency heal, because it doesn't cost you your action and is only a first level spell. Hex and Hunter's Mark are here kind of by default, honestly, just because these are the damage spells that you shouldn't build a Hunter or a Warlock without Hex or Hunter's Mark at early levels, because they won't have other uses for their bonus actions or concentration, and there will be a huge amount of extra damage in a given fight. Almost always correct to concentrate on these spells early on and just do a lot of extra damage. At later levels, you will probably want to swap out Hex and Hunter's Mark for other spells, because you'll have different uses for your concentration, but these are really important for their respective classes, and doing damage with them early is very valuable. A Warlock with Hex and Eldritch Blast and Agonizing Blast, the invocation that you get at level 2, will be one of the highest damaging characters in the game, and they can do it at range and very consistently, because they can concentrate on their Hex to do an extra d6 damage with every Eldritch Blast shot that they cast, plus their additional charisma damage. Similarly, a Ranger can get lots of additional bonuses out of Hunter's Mark. Longstrider is free. It's a ritual spell, so it costs no resources to activate, and every single party should have access to this and should cast it on everybody in their party at the beginning of the day. Movement speed is incredibly powerful, because like I said, the goal of Baldur's Gate combat is to reduce relevant enemy actions as much as possible. Being out of their range reduces their actions to 0. If they can't get to you to attack you, then they can't do anything. So being able to move to the enemy that you want to hit and away from the enemies you don't want to get hit by is really valuable, and this spell is, as I said, free. There's no reason not to take it, and you absolutely should have access to it in every party. Magic Missile is the only only pure damage spell that's appearing on this list, and that's because it is 100% reliable. I guess actually 99.5% reliable, because they can block it with the shield spell. Being able to just guaranteed do damage is really good. Remember I said that the goal of combat the goal of a damage spell is to remove an enemy from combat. Now, typically, you would want that either to be so much damage that it one-shots them, or extremely reliable damage, so an enemy who's already been hurt by something else can absolutely 100% be removed from combat. Magic Missile fills the second role, where you can guaranteed pick off low health enemies, and then you don't have to worry about them rolling a save, or you missing your attack on them, or waste another turn. You can get multiple enemies with this. There's also one encounter in the game in Act 1 that this spell solves completely, or doesn't solve completely, but makes significantly easier, because you can pop the illusions with it, and that is extremely powerful. Overall, just an incredible spell, and it combos really, really well with damage riders from various sources to give you, because it's multiple shots, so you can gain additional damage on Magic Missile. This is another one that you aren't going to cast all the time, but you should always have access to it, because when you do want it, nothing else will do the same job, and it does the job perfectly. Sanctuary is an incredible defensive effect. You can use it for various reasons. One, to, as you might expect, to save an ally who's in danger, but also you can use it to protect an ally who's concentrating on a buff For example, you can have a character cast haste and then use sanctuary. It doesn't take their concentration, and so that can be extremely valuable, and there's no like saves against it from the enemy. They just can't target that creature, meaning that they are almost perfectly safe when you have sanctuary up. This has another one like Minor Illusion that just has so many possible uses that it would be impossible to list them all, but the number of creative uses you can come up with for Sanctuary is incredible. Block doorways with it, group enemies by having them move around your Sanctuary character, protect buffs, protect endangered allies, and so on. Just an incredible spell that you definitely want to have access to. Finally, Shield is a reaction that gives you +5 AC and is the best defensive reaction in the game, or maybe second best after the Illithid power, but it will block so much damage over the course of the game. With Shield, you want to make sure that you have in the reactions tab, you want to set it to ask you to use it, because you don't want to waste your reaction on a low damage attack, and you want to make sure you don't accidentally use shield when you would rather use counterspell or something like that. But this spell will save you so much grief and prevent so much damage to your characters over the course of the game, it would be very foolish to leave home without it. Armor of Agathis is a great spell for warlocks because it allows them to trade one of their spellcasts that are refreshed on short rest for an effect that lasts all day. So it lets you trade a short rest resource for a long rest resource, which is pretty good. It upcasts extremely well, getting an additional 5 HP and an additional 5 return damage, and warlocks upcast for free, so it's really good there. It's also really good in certain builds like the Abjuration Wizard build, and in those builds it's incredibly broken. You can check out the Mighty Tank Wizard video that I did on that build if you're interested in more of that. It combos extremely well with a bunch of other things like Blade Ward as well, but it is also just a great default action for using your spell slots on in the early game as a warlock. Dissonant Whispers is a control spell because it stops enemies from moving. It does good damage, but more importantly will stop an enemy from moving for 2 turns with only a single saving throw. That's 2 turns of disable against melee enemies for only a single saving throw, an incredible ratio, plus the additional damage on top of it. Just a great spell overall. Enhanced Leap gives you tons of mobility. I talked a little about why mobility is so powerful when we were discussing Longstrider, but this will often be an extra 20 or 30 feet of movement when cast on a strength character, and you can use it for free, so that part is really nice, since it is a ritual that doesn't take your concentration. So it is just free mobility for a character for 10 turns, which is very useful in certain fights, always worth having. Ensnaring Strike is again here a little bit by default, and it's because the ranger has the bounty hunter favored enemy ability, which gives the enemies disadvantage on ensnaring strike. It's slightly worse than the other single target disables, although still very good in and of itself. But the fact that enemies will always be making the save with disadvantage makes this incredibly reliable to land, and it doesn't take your action. You get to use it as part of a weapon attack, which is extremely nice, so you can do a bunch of extra damage alongside it. Entangle gives you a very large radius, very large disable. This will let you trade your concentration and action for a bunch of enemy actions as long as they fail the saves against the Entangle. It also targets strength, so there are some enemies that have very low strengths but high other stats, so your Entangle will work very reliably against them. Being able to use a level 1 spell to disable a whole bunch of enemies all at once is incredibly powerful, and this only takes a first level spell slot in order to do that. Fog Cloud is blinding with no save, so if cast on an enemy, they are just blinded when inside the Fog Cloud. It also provides heavy obscurement, so if you hide inside it using the hide action, enemies can't see you at all and won't be able to shoot you or attack you. That's most useful for rogues or Gloomstalker rangers that get to hide as a bonus action and can hide inside their own Fog Clouds, but you can also cast it on top of any enemies with that are held in place in some way to blind them, gaining advantage on your attacks against them, as well as preventing them from doing anything to you while they are blinded. That's just an incredibly powerful effect, and any effect that has no save against it is extremely valuable to pay attention to, which is part of why stuff like Magic Missile or Sanctuary are so good, because enemies don't get to interact. The Enemy of optimization is randomness. We always want to try to reduce randomness as much as possible, so we should always look at effects that have no save very, very carefully to see if they are powerful, and in the case of Fog Cloud, the disable that it provides, Blinded, is quite powerful, and so it is very good to be able to cast this spell. Grease is a huge radius, 15 feet for a first level spell, so it's the largest area of effect of any first level spell, and you can hit an enormous part of the combat arena with it, knocking a whole bunch of enemies over. Enemies that move on it will fall over again. You can also light it on fire for small amounts of damage, but generally speaking, you'd rather not do that and just have the enemies continuously falling over in the grease. This is an extremely powerful ground targeting effect that you can use to knock a bunch of enemies over. It is very similar to Chromatic Orb or Ice Knife in that it is basically just a big ice surface with the grease. But it's very, compared to them, it doesn't do damage, but covers a much larger area, which means that it is often correct to use grease rather than using one of those two. Although they will all have their place, and you will vary between the three of them pretty frequently. Ice Knife it's exactly the same as Chromatic Orb, although you can't change the damage type. It does damage to the main target and then creates an ice surface on the ground, and so is going to knock a lot of enemies over. And the damage is a nice rider, but like all of the other damage spells that we've discussed here, the main point is the control effect, because it creates an ice surface, and enemies will therefore fall over on the ice, and that is incredibly powerful. Finally, Thunderous Smite is good because it's only 2 less average damage than just spending a level 1 spell on a normal Paladin Smite. So while it does a little less damage, it also has the potential to knock them over. Sometimes that's better than 2 damage, is making them make a save or fall over. And you can layer it on top of a smite attack, of an actual smite. It costs you 2 spell slots to do that, but you can smite and Thunderous Smite in the same turn if you just need a really high damage attack. Often you'll be deciding whether it's better to try to knock an enemy over or do more damage with your Paladin on your turn, but sometimes you'll just need to burst down an enemy in one turn, and doing both at the same time is really, really good. Other notable spells in first level that I want to mention as being incredibly important to keep in mind are Disguise Self and Speak with Animals, because again, these are rituals, so they are free to cast, and it's very much worth keeping those in mind. Featherfall, which lets you get to areas that you wouldn't be able to access otherwise and do all sorts of weird things with sequencing in the game, and even if you aren't trying to like speed run or break the game or anything, being able to approach different parts of the arena or take fights from different areas than you normally would is very useful. And again, being able to do that with no resources because it's a ritual is very valuable, so keep Featherfall in mind. And Mage Armor is very useful for some builds that don't have access to armor, because if they don't have armor proficiency, you may want to raise their AC using Mage Armor. That is a relatively narrow subset of builds, and often it is better to just get armor proficiency from your racial option or whatever, and use that. But Mage Armor does have use if you don't otherwise have armor proficiency from somewhere else. Level 2 spells. Level 2 is actually where we get a lot of our damaging spells from, and we're going to use these for damage throughout a lot of the game very regularly. The reason for this is that level 2 is where the damage spells now have numbers that are significantly higher than the damage that a cantrip could do, but they aren't so high level that they're competing with the really powerful control and utility spells from later levels. So actually, most of your damage spells are going to come from second level spells for a lot of the game, although of course there are higher level spells that will fill the damage role later on, but you will be surprised by how often most of your spellcaster's damage comes from casting a second level spell. We'll start here with Aid, which is an incredible self buff, or an incredible party buff, because it gives your party maximum HP, and the reason that it's so good is it hits every creature in the party. including summons, familiars, animal companions, and so on, and just increases their base health. So this combines with other sources of temporary hit points, and also you can heal that health back. It's incredibly powerful and will make your party much more survivable. You can also cast this from a camp follower, a character who's planning to stay home and not come on your adventuring day, and then it doesn't even cost you resources, though even if you cast it using your party's resources, aid is still really good. If you are doing that, I recommend casting it with the second highest level spell slot you have available. Use your highest level spell slots for damage and use your lowest level spell slots for control and utility, and then you use your mid-level spell slots for buffs and like major combat effects, and that will generally be a good rule of thumb overall. So with aid, if you are say level 7 and have access to 4th level spells, you can spend a level 3 spell slot on aid and do really well without having used one of your most important resources, but gain a lot of additional utility throughout the day. Cloud of Daggers is almost certainly the best damage spell in the game, secretly, because it has, say it with me, no saving throw. Cloud of Daggers takes your concentration, but it's an AoE spell, and it does damage when enemies enter it and at the start of their turn, so you get to double dip on the damage on this spell, because they take damage when you cast it, and then again at the start of their turn. That means not only is it an AoE damage spell with no saving throw, it's also actually the highest average single target damage of any spell at this level. It does 20 average damage to a single target, which is lower only than Scorching Ray and Moonbeam at second level, but it has no saving throw. Those both do have saving throws for half, so you are much more, those both can potentially miss, and so you are much more likely to get the highest possible average damage out of Cloud of Daggers. So not only is it an AoE damage spell, it's also your best option for single target damage throughout a big chunk of the game. The fact that this is so reliable, of course, because there is no saving throw, it makes it incredibly strong. It will also do damage turn after turn after turn, so you can keep enemies trapped inside of it to make sure that they die. Just a great spell, and if you are looking for damage, this is the place to start. Darkness gives you perfect immunity to enemy ranged attacks when you're inside the darkness, and if you have a way to see in the dark, then you don't get blinded by it, so it's great for warlocks who have the Devil Sight invocation, or if you have immunity to blind from the ring that gives you immunity to blind. The way to use this spell is to use it as kind of a turtle style or a fortress where you keep your party in it, have them move out to attack on their turn, and then move back into it at the end of their turn, preventing enemy ranged attacks. You do have to be a little bit careful because when your characters are blinded by the darkness, enemies will have advantage against them, but they will also have disadvantage because if they enter the darkness, they'll be blinded, and so you can benefit from this because it gives you complete immunity to enemy ranged attacks. You can also place this down on top of enemies to basically be an extra fog cloud, but both uses of this spell are incredible. It is a core component of any defensive party setup and one that you're always going to want to use. Misty Step is the best mobility option. I believe that every character in the entire game, bar none, should contrive to get access to Misty Step. There's a lot of items that give it to you, and so you're going to want to take it on your spellcasters and get items of it on your characters, because it solves all your positioning problems by itself. It is just a sort of no questions asked, you are exactly where you want to be spell, and it only costs you a bonus action, which is, of course, incredibly valuable. Spiritual Weapon and Flaming Sphere I'm going to discuss together because these are time-limited summons, and the big use of these is to block doorways, force enemies to attack them, restrict enemy movement, cause enemies to become distracted, and so on. Flaming Sphere also has a bunch of extra utility of lighting surfaces on fire, but is slightly less useful because it requires your concentration and isn't a bonus action, whereas Spiritual Weapon is a bonus action. The ability to mess up enemy movement and positioning with these spells is incredibly strong. Use them to block doorways, use them to keep enemy movement restricted. Again, the goal of these spells is actually less damage, although the consistent damage is pretty nice, and more control, and that will stay true for a lot of the spells that you will see. A lot of summon spells, and just in general, a lot of spells overall. One thing that I mentioned, as I mentioned with cantrips, and this will hold true in general, is that damage spells are linear, or damage is linear. More damage is better. So you don't need like multiple damage spells. You just use the best damage spell that does the most damage. At this level, that's mostly Cloud of Daggers. And then you need a whole bunch of utility options. And you can get additional damage from those utility options, like with these summons. But overall, you are looking for spells that give you additional control of fights more than you are looking for spells that do raw damage. Though at spell level 2, you get a few more raw damage options. Heat Metal gives you a pretty consistent disable for enemies that also does a bunch of extra damage. It's a pretty powerful disabling effect, giving them disadvantage on everything and disarming them, both of which are very powerful options, and you get a lot of extra damage over the course of the fight. Definitely a great thing to concentrate on, and can also be used for taking out certain powerful enemies who have metal weapons by disarming them, which will make them useless. Hold Person is both a control spell and a damage spell. It's slightly less reliable than the pure damage spells at damage, because you need to hit the enemy with it, have them fail their save, and then have one of your characters go to get the automatic critical hits, so it's reliant on your initiative. And it's slightly less reliable than other control spells, because it's limited in who it can target, and enemies get to save against it every turn, and they can even break out before they lose an action to this spell. But the combination of it being both potentially one of the highest damage spell in the game, because guaranteed critical hits with a high-level martial character can be massive damage, as well as being a pretty reasonable control spell, are very powerful. Also, especially worth noting that if you are cheesing your save DCs super high using the Helm of Arcane Acuity, in particular, or other sources of really, really high save DCs, this is the best spell in the game because it has the most debilitating effect. So if your saving throws are so high that enemies can't pass them, then Hold Person is going to gain some additional value in that situation. But for most characters, it's just a great spell rather than an incredible spell. Moonbeam is similar to Cloud of Daggers. It's an AoE. It's just a lot of damage. It's just a damage spell that does very consistent damage. You get to double dip because they take the damage when you cast it or when you move it on top of them, and also at the beginning of their turns. And it's just a lot of damage. One of the best things for a druid to concentrate on. Scorching Ray is one of the best spells to upcast because it gets additional attacks, and these can all critical hit, and so similar to Eldritch Blast, multiple attack rolls is always good because they can critical hit, they can all apply different damage modifiers. By default, it's 21 average damage, but it also upcasts very well, and if you need single target damage that isn't concentration, then you'll use Scorching Ray rather than Cloud of Daggers. Or if you have damage rider modifiers that apply on top of Scorching Ray, like let's say you're a fire sorcerer who gets extra damage, or an evocation wizard who gets extra damage on every ray, then Scorching Ray just does a lot of damage. I think this is one of the best single target damage spells in the game, just because it allows you to apply that and gives you the option to get lots of critical hits with it. Silence is only good in some fights, but it is very good in those fights, and it's a ritual, so it doesn't cost you a spell slot. It's just worth having available for those fights. If you need to prevent an enemy from casting spells, Silence is your boy, and is going to do so without even costing you a spell slot. And Spike Growth massively restricts enemy movement. It will cause enemies to take damage, but also it's difficult terrain, so they have to slog slowly through it, taking damage the whole time. This is one of the best ways to keep enemies inside damaging effects, like Cloud of Daggers, and is therefore very good. Other notable spells at this level include Enhanceability, which I think is always worth having prepared, though often not worth casting, because there's actually very few skill checks in the game that are where failing them has a higher cost associated with it than a level 2 spell slot. So only for very important skill checks is Enhanceability actually worth casting. Let's say that you're making a skill check to get, I don't know, 1,000 gold, right? And Enhanceability gives you advantage on it, which is roughly +4 on the skill check, or a plus 20% chance of succeeding on the skill check. That is, you can measure that out at 20% of 1,000 gold, or an expected value on the spell of 200 gold. Is 200 gold better than a level 2 spell slot? Like, probably not, depending on how often you long rest. So enhanceability is only useful if it's giving you something that is really, really powerful, but there's enough important skill checks in the game that you should have this ready when you are going to make one of those. Invisibility has a lot of out-of-combat utility, and Lesser Restoration is a great panic button, and also can remove Astarion's blood loss debuff, which is going to be very valuable throughout a lot of encounters in the game. Other than that, Pass Without Trace is useful for one specific build with greater invisibility. Warding Bond can be cast by a camp follower, although that's a pretty cheesy effect, but you can have the damage to all of your characters by having a character in your camp take half the damage for them. Level 3 spells are where your characters get enormous power spikes. When your party hits 5th level and gets access to level 3 spells and extra attack, they get wildly better at combat. And part of this is the incredible power of the level 3 spells. The name of the game here is concentration. Almost always a level 3 spell is the best thing for your character to be concentrating on. Remember that I said Bless was the best thing for a cleric to be concentrating on. Well, that changes when you hit level 3, and suddenly all the level 3 control spells are the best things to be concentrating on. The concentration-based control spells available at level 3 are absurd, and basically every combat, one of the main decisions that you're going to make is which of these extremely powerful concentration spells do I use to take all the enemies out of the fight so that we can clean them up at our leisure. This is what we're here for when we're playing a spellcaster. First up, Counterspell is probably the most powerful single effect in the game, because it just, for your reaction, removes an entire enemy turn. You can stop an enemy spell, which would be extremely dangerous. Always remember to put this on ask on use, so that you don't waste it on like a cantrip, but you will definitely want to cast Counterspell against dangerous enemy spells. Make sure that you use a spell of the appropriate level. I talk about that extensively in my entry on Counterspells in the tier list, so I won't reiterate that, but you want to use a spell of the same level as the enemy spell to guarantee that it gets countered. This is incredibly powerful and will keep you alive in all sorts of circumstances where you would not otherwise be able to survive. Haste is the best buff in the game. It gives your character an extra action, which is basically like adding a 5th party member. You can twin it if you're a sorcerer. You can keep it active with Sanctuary. It is just so incredibly strong to just have an extra action every turn. You can cast it before combat starts, so it doesn't even cost you an action in combat to use. So Haste is going to give you effectively a 5th party member, and is therefore one of the most powerful effects available. You should pretty much always ask yourself whether it's right to have haste on whatever character you have access to it on. In honor mode, it's best on spellcasters because they can cast multiple spells with it, whereas marshals are restricted to a single extra attack. In particular, this is really good when cast on a warlock who just gets to activate all their Eldritch Blasts for as much as they want. Hunger of Hadar is the most debilitating area of effect spell in the game, pretty much. It is one of the worst things for enemies to be caught in. It is a large AoE and extremely dangerous. It's going to stop them from moving, jumping, seeing things, and it will do constant damage to them. Just an incredibly dangerous spell that will take a huge number of enemies out of the fight. Spirit Guardians is one of the best damage effects in the game because it is extremely reliable. You run around the field doing damage to everything. It also upcasts really well because you're very likely to hit lots of enemies with it, and typically for a cleric, one of the best uses for your spell slots is to cast Spirit Guardians with your highest level spell slot and just walk next to a bunch of enemies. The more mobility you have, the more reliably you can apply Spirit Guardians, so it's very helpful to have extra mobility on characters that are using it. And it is just going to be one of the best damaging effects in the game. Always worth considering spending your concentration on this spell, unless enemies are immune to radiant damage or have some other effect that makes you not want to hit them with radiant damage. This is also just very good. It is extremely powerful against lots of low health enemies, of which there are some dangerous encounters, especially in Act 2, against lots of low health enemies, and Spirit Guardians will solve those encounters all by itself, as well as being a great contributor to every other combat that you'll face. Incidentally, these 4 S-tier spells at level 3, if you are a lore bard, selecting magical secrets at level 6, these 4 are almost certainly the 4 that you're choosing from. Usually, you'll take Counterspell and then one of Haste, Hunger of Hadar, or Hunger of Hadar, Spirit Guardians if you're doing a specific build. It's also always worth thinking about Command, because like I said, one of the best actions with any spell slot that you can take is just to command that number of creatures, and Command is so good that it's often even worth spending a magical secret on, although you can also get it from a 1-level dip into Fiend Warlock. But that just tells you how good these level 3 spells are, because if you're taking a magical secret on your bard and have your choice of just about every spell in the game, you're probably choosing 2 of these 4. Animate Dead is a summon that lasts... So it lasts you all day and gets a lot of benefits if you're a necromancer as well, but just in general, those summons are very powerful. My personal recommendation is to cast this with a level 4 spell slot primarily for the 3 skeleton archers, because those are going to be the easiest to use and will contribute to your day most often. Although you do have to be ready to micro them around in combat, which takes a long time and does annoy a lot of people. Call Lightning is another similar to Spirit Guardians, is just an excellent damage spell that's going to be very consistent damage throughout the fight and is going to work very well. You can always, because it's a small area, you can always avoid hitting allies with it if you need to. You can maximize it if you're a Tempest Cleric. You can double it by getting enemies wet because it's lightning damage, and that makes it incredibly strong. You also will be able to just use this turn after turn after turn, and so it will end up being just a ton of damage in a lot of combats, and is a great thing to concentrate on if you need damage. Fear inflicts the second most crippling, or the second best condition on enemies, the Fearful condition, because the best is Paralyzed, but Fearful is really good because they run away, can't take actions, and they can only be broken out of it if they break line of sight with you, which is somewhat hard to do. So this will just take enemies completely out of the fight. Glyph of Warding, similar to Chromatic Orb, is a great damage spell. It does all of the available elements in damage, and also has the ability to put enemies to sleep. It's not a huge AoE, but it is just an incredible one-shot damage spell. It doesn't take your concentration. You cast it directly on enemies, it'll go off immediately, and the modal ability to choose between a solid nuke and a solid disable makes it incredibly valuable to have access to. Hypnotic Pattern is huge and just takes basically every enemy in a fight out of commission. They can wake each other up, but it is an enormous AoE and a devastating condition because they can't do anything when they're hypnotized, and this lets you pick them apart one by one at your leisure. Mass Healing Word is good primarily for the items that allow you to apply buffs with it, and I do think that you should evaluate it in that circumstance. Any character that's taking Mass Healing Word will take the Hellrider's Pride and the ring and the gloves that let you apply Blade Ward and Bless to your characters, and this lets you apply that to your whole party with only a single action. It hits everybody. The description claims there's a limit of 6 creatures, but that doesn't seem to have been implemented in the game, so you can bless, yourself and 20 minions with Mass Healing Word if you want to. And then Sleet Storm it instantly breaks enemy concentration, which is good, but more importantly is just a gigantic AoE ice surface, and remember how good ice surfaces are. Well, a 30-foot radius ice surface is going to cover the entire arena, knock enemies prone, instantly break enemy concentration, and enemies will continuously fall prone as long as they are getting hit by this ice in Sleet Storm. It also won't melt, or it will, but will then be reapplied as long as you're continuing to concentrate on it. So even if an enemy uses a fire attack or you accidentally hit it with some fire, you just get the ice surface back next turn, and enemies will again be trapped in it. All of the B-tier spells, I think, are notable in this list, but basically, Lightning Bolt is probably your best non-concentration damage spell at this level, because you can double it with the wet condition. It's not that easy to hit more than 2 enemies with it, but it's usually pretty reliable to hit 2 enemies, and if you do so and double it by getting the enemies wet, it's going to be a ton of extra damage. Fireball is more reliable to hit multiple enemies, but can't be doubled. Plant Growth is one of the best ways to keep enemies in debilitating effects, of which there are a bunch of them, because it's not concentration, and it quarters enemy movement, so all of those are incredibly strong options to have available. And slow is really good if you, for whatever reason, can't use one of the other debilitating effects, most often because the enemies and your allies are mixed really tightly together, and so you wouldn't be able to cast Hypnotic Pattern or whatever, Sleet Storm, without hitting a bunch of your allies. Slow can be really good in those circumstances, and also if a fight's going to go really long against a boss, you can use slow against them to make sure that you keep them locked down for the fight. Warden of Vitality is the best out-of-combat healing in the game, and also the core of a build that I posted pretty recently called the Best Healer in Baldur's Gate 3, so that's another notable one. And that's pretty much it for the level 3 spells. Overall, you're going to be looking to these for your concentration. Pretty much every fight, these are the spells that are going to win you that fight. And so you want to select the debilitating concentration spell that will win you that specific fight, and then cast it, and that's how your spellcasters will succeed. Level 4 spells are where we start to see many fewer S and A tier spells than at previous levels, partly because there's just fewer level 4 spells overall, but also because they're competing with the incredibly powerful spells that we got at levels 1, 2, and 3, many of which can be upcast with a level 4 spell slot to do something way better than the level 4 spells are capable of. I come back to this example a lot, but if you take Command with a 4th level spell slot, that knocks 4 creatures out of the fight for 1 turn. That's a great use of a 4th level spell slot, and something that actually not that many 4th level spells are capable of doing. Even the level 3 spells that are pure damage often get to be upcast for more damage than the 4th level damage spells, and so on. And so the 4th level spells that we really want to prepare and cast are ones that that do unique things or have particularly interesting applications compared to lower level spells. Often you're better off spending your 4th level slots on lower level upcasted spells. That's one reason I recommend using a 4th level slot for aid most days, even at maximum level, because there's not a lot that's actually competing for your 4th level spell slots, so you might as well spend them on upcasted utility spells that you want to upcast. Aid and Armor of Agathis and stuff can be cast with 4th level spells for pretty good value, whereas the 4th level spells themselves may not get as much as the upcasted level 1 spells. However, there's still some real bangers at this level, including Conjure Woodland Being, which gives you not 1 but 2 summons for the price of a single 4th level spell slot, and each of those summons has spells that it can cast, including Spike Growth and Entangle. So basically you're getting 5 spells for the price of 1 on this spell. Just an incredible spell. It's one of the it's almost certainly the best summon in the game in terms of value to spell slot ratio, and the amount of power that you get just from casting this at the beginning of the day is ludicrous. You can keep them alive pretty easily because one of them even has self-healing, but they can also just be healed. But even if you don't like hauling summons around throughout the entire day because it's annoying to micro them around, this spell is so good that it's just good enough to cast for 1 fight and then dismiss them at the end of the fight, and it will give you more utility than like pretty much any other spell you would have been able to cast in that fight would have, even if you don't use it all day, but you can use it all day and get all the value there. Banishment is a single target disable, just removes an enemy from the fight, and the only reason that this spell is good is that it targets Charisma, and Charisma save is one of the best saves to target because a lot of enemies have truly terrible Charisma saves. I will do a spoiler here, so if you are not interested in any spoilers, I'm going to mention the Charisma saves of a specific late game boss. You should just skip ahead for a moment, but spoiler is coming in 3, 2, 1. Orin's Slayer form has -1 Charisma save, and she has +12 to Dexterity and like +10 to Constitution and stuff. So the difference between targeting her Slayer form with Banishment and targeting her with another disable spell is a saving throw. Basically, it's more than an entire legendary resistance difference. So targeting some bosses with this spell means that they will basically auto-fail against any reasonable DC on your characters, and so this is an incredibly useful spell to have access to for the encounters where enemy charisma saves are low, of which there are many, and some important enemies have very, very low charisma saves. Greater Invisibility has 2 uses. One, it's just invisibility, so you can always prepare it and use it just as normal invisibility, but you can also interact with stuff without, like, open doors and stuff without setting off the uh, without ending your invisibility. But also you can cast it on an ally with high stealth checks, and they can make attacks or cast spells while invisible. And as long as they continuously pass stealth checks, they get to continuously make free attacks. So you can get lots of free attacks with this spell before combat starts, getting you tons of damage value out of this spell before combat starts. There's also like super broken builds built around optimizing that, but even just as a normal usage of this spell, 2 free attacks with your rogue before combat starts is a lot of damage, and that's just very good. Spiritual or Guardian of Faith, excuse me, is a summon, but it's also a damage spell, and it does 60 damage by default, does 60 damage for a level 4 spell slot, which is a great ratio of damage. It also can be used to block doorways. It tanks really well because it's got 20 AC. You can also eke more damage out of it by healing it with aid or protecting it with warding bond, etc. All sorts of cool stuff you can do with this spell. I go into some detail about this in my spell, in the individual entry for it in the tier lists, but this spell has a ton of utility, just like all of the in-combat summons, and it's also huge, so you can block really large choke points with it. Just a great spell overall. Wall of Fire will solve certain encounters entirely on its own. Any encounter where a lot of enemies with low hit points are coming towards you, this will end very easily. It's also one of the best ways to start a combat from stealth, because enemies who are surprised will just spend their entire turn standing still, and then they'll take the damage a second time from the Wall of Fire. So they'll take it when you initially cast it, and then they'll take it at the beginning of their second turn after they've wasted their turn in the surprise round. So it's a great way to initiate combat for lots of damage. It's also just one of the best damaging effects to keep enemies trapped in with various control effects, and overall just an incredible spell that you should have access to. Some other notable spells at this level include Freedom of Movement, which can break you out of stuns, so a great emergency button to have access to. Confusion, which is a less reliable disable than the level 3 disables for the most part, because enemies have a chance of acting normally, but doesn't hit allies. So if the combat is really mixed up, then Confusion can be good, because you can cast it into a combat with allies and enemies all mixed together and get a pretty solid disable out of it. Hailstorm, or Ice Storm, excuse me, which does a big ice surface that's not concentration. Now, it's a 20-foot ice surface, so it's only slightly larger than Grease. A lot of times, if you need a non-concentration deck save or fall prone surface, you're better off just using the lower level Grease spell. But Ice Storm is still just a very good spell. It competes with Sleet Storm, and it competes with Grease, but it does good damage and knocks a bunch of enemies over without taking your concentration, so it is just a powerful spell to have in your arsenal, and one that you'll use sometimes when those other spells aren't the better things to use. And then Grasping Vine was recently buffed significantly. I rated this trash tier in my tier list, and it was trash tier, but now it's a bonus action that doesn't take your concentration and entangles, and a bonus action summon, like we saw with Spiritual Weapon, is very good. Entangling as a bonus action is really interesting, because you can use it while also casting another spell that keeps enemies trapped, or another spell that you want to keep enemies trapped in. You can use that in the same turn as like a Cloud Kill or something to entangle enemies inside the Cloud Kill. And so this spell, I haven't had a chance to test it extensively because it was just changed in patch 6, but I think this will be actually a solid role player going forward. Level 5 spells suffer even worse than level 4 spells by comparison to earlier spell levels, because they are almost all damage spells, and most of the time it's more efficient to cast earlier leveled damage spells with a level 5 spell slot than to actually cast the 5th level damage spells. For example, Wall of Fire Upcast is more damage than just about all of the level 5 damage spells, and so you are usually just going to use that, or Spirit Guardians, or something like that if you need damage. Even Cloud of Daggers Upcast to 5th level is quite strong in terms of damage, compared to it's more damage than, for example, Insect Swarm, or Insect Plague. So Cloud of Daggers upcast to 5th level is often going to supersede the damage on a lot of these spells itself. So when you're comparing damage spells, as always, we're just looking for the highest numbers, and the 5th level spells being damage spells that often don't have the highest numbers or have other reasons why they're not that great are going to suffer in comparison to just upcasting lower level spells. Primarily. However, again, there are some really, really good spells, and one of these is another one of the summons, Conjure Elemental. Conjure Elemental, you can summon the air elemental. You can summon the elementals with the 5th level version, or the myrmidons with the 6th level version. Generally speaking, all of the different elementals have their uses, and all the different myrmidons have their uses. I think that in general, for the sort of generic party, the water elemental and the water myrmidon are actually going to be both the best of these to summon, though I highly encourage you to experiment with summoning different elementals and different myrmidons and seeing which one fits best in your party, because which one's best to summon is going to depend heavily on your party. These have great they're solid tanks. They have great utility. They do lots of extra damage. All of these summons are excellent. The Myrmidon summons are definitely the best 6th level summon, and so usually you're going to want Conjure Elemental cast with a 6th level spell slot rather than a 5th level spell slot to get the Myrmidon summon, and that's one of the best possible uses for your 6th level spell slot, and so Conjure Elemental is just really good in that sense. Curriculum of Strategy. Artistry of War is a secret spell that you can only learn from a wizard scroll, and it is basically super magic missile. It's good for all the same reasons magic missile is, but also it just does excellent damage, and so this spell is just very good. It's one of the best actions for non-concentration based damage in the game. It's unresistible because it's force damage, or basically unresistible. There's also a lot of enemies that are some dangerous enemies that are vulnerable to force damage, and this will do double damage against them. And it never misses. It's extremely reliable, huge amounts of damage, great spell. Destructive Wave is only available to Tempest and Light Clerics as a domain spell, but it is just a very solid damage spell that knocks enemies over. It also knocks enemies over. It's great for applying Radiant Orb. It can be maximized, or half of it can be maximized if you're a Tempest Cleric, though I wouldn't recommend doing that. But it's just a great use of an action. It's going to hit the entire field and knock them prone. Good damage and good effect, and it doesn't hit allies, so you can use it in the middle of a fight with perfect impunity. And so often your cleric is going to want to be running around with a Spirit Guardians cast at level 4, and then using Destructive Wave as their 5th level spell, and that will be their main contribution to the combat, as well as having cast a Spiritual Weapon with a 2nd level spell slot. That's like a very typical combat setup for a cleric, is to be running around with Spiritual Guardian at 4th level, Destructive Wave with their 5th level spells, and buffs and defensive spells with their lower level spells. So this is a great component for Tempest and Light Clerics. And then Hold Monster is just Hold Person, but a higher level. It can hit everything, which is nice, and so anytime you want Hold Person, you but can't use it because it anytime you would want Hold Person but can't use it because the target isn't a person or isn't a humanoid, you can hit them with Hold Monster, and that will be totally reasonable. It's not quite as strong just because it's a much more valuable resource with a 5th level spell slot, and unlike Hold Person, you can't hit lots of enemies with it because you can't upcast it as easily, but it is going to be still just very good in the circumstances where you want it. Banishing Smite is notable also outside of the S and A tier, just as because it is one of the better spells to pick as a magical secret for a bard paladin, a sword bard paladin multiclass, because you can stack it on top of a normal smite to do just a ton of damage, and it's just very good in that case. And Cloud Kill is actually a great damage spell, but a lot of enemies are immune to poison. But if you need a damage spell in a fight where enemies are not immune to poison, Cloud Kill is one of your best possible options. It does actually excellent damage. Cone of Cold is good if you're a wet focused party, and Wall of Stone can be used in some encounters to divide the encounters. So just some other notable spells that have uses in this tier, but for the most part you're using this spell tier to upcast lower level spells. Finally, for level 6 spells, you'll notice that there's a bunch more of these spells in the high tiers again, and that is because level 6 spells, unlike 4th and 5th level spells, you are much less likely to use lower level spells upcasted to 6th level, because the 6th level spells have such powerful, unique effects that you really do want to use them on actual 6th level spells. One exception to this is one I've already mentioned, which is Conjure Elemental, which the Myrmidon version of Conjure Elemental is basically a 6th level spell, so it's always worth casting that one as a 6th level spell slot as well. 6th level spells are your character's ultimate abilities, you could think of them that way. Usually you only get one per day, and so which you choose is going to be extremely important and is going to significantly affect either the encounter you use it in or the entire adventuring day, and so the criteria for selecting these should be either does it win the encounter by itself using only a single cast of that spell, or does it make every encounter make several encounters for an entire adventuring day all significantly easier. So usually you will want to select your 6th level spells either to singularly win an encounter or to make a whole bunch of encounters much, much easier so that you can gain the amount of resources that you want out of those 6th level spells. To that end, there are basically two types of spells, either encounter winning spells or adventuring day winning spells. Conjure Elemental Myrmidon is one that we've already talked about and is in the latter category because it just makes every fight that you have that day that much easier since you have a Myrmidon around to help you out. For the 6th level spells that I recommend taking, Globe of Invulnerability is going to win not only the encounter that you cast it in, but all of the hardest encounters in the game, basically, are soloed by this spell, because all of the hardest encounters in the game are boss fights in which the bosses are just pouring on tons of damage. Especially in Act 3, the way that they've made the game hard is just by increasing enemy damage massively for the most part, and enemies still won't use a lot of dangerous control effects. Obviously that does happen, but for the most part your goal is just to either kill the enemy before they can damage you, or have some way to survive the incredible damage output that they're putting out. Globe of Invulnerability makes you perfectly immune to damage, so you will just instantly win any encounter that's a damage race, which is most of them, including all of the really difficult ones. I highly recommend every party has access to this spell because it's going to win you all of the hardest fights in the game all by itself. Hero's Feast lasts all day and doesn't take your concentration. It gives you a whole bunch of buffs, including extra hit points, extra immunities to poison, disease, and fear, all of which are very relevant immunities, as well as advantage on wisdom saves. Wisdom saves are the most debilitating conditions. Like Aid, this can be cast by a camp follower, so you can have a character who's not coming on your adventuring day cast Hero's Feast, but even if cast by your active party, this spell is so good that it is definitely worth spending your 6th level spell slot on. I think that in general, for a cleric or druid, you're choosing between day-long buffs for your 6th level spell slots. So for a cleric, you're either casting Planar Ally or Hero's Feast with your 6th level spell, and usually I would recommend Hero Feast. For druids, you're either casting Summon Myrmidon or Conjure Elemental for a Myrmidon, or you're casting Hero's Feast. Usually I'd recommend the Myrmidon summon for the druids, because I think they're just that strong. Although if you have that from a wizard instead, then you should use Hero's Feast with your druid. Either way, there's also a bunch of encounters where fear immunity is really powerful, and so Hero's Feast is really good for those. So highly recommend every party have this active. Of course, it also benefits all your summons as well, so the more summons you have, the better it gets. Chain Lightning is the best damage spell in the game, if considered in isolation, because it is doubleable with the wet condition. It hits 4 enemies for full damage, so it is going to do up to a maximum of 640 damage if you double it against 4 different enemies, and that is obviously an absurd amount of damage that's going to one-shot a whole bunch of encounters, so this one, when cast, is usually going to win the encounter if you get the enemy wet first and then hit them with Chain Lightning. One thing that people did say when I did my tier list for 6th level spells is a lot of people said Chain Lightning should be S tier because you can cast it 5 times in a turn, but if using like Mark a Heshkir and Quicken Spell and whatever, but if you cast any 6th level spell 5 times in a turn, you're going to win the encounter. That's not a point in particular in favor of Chain Lightning, but this spell is still just an incredible an incredible damage source, and if you need damage, it is by far the best way to do damage. Auto's Irresistible Dance is a no-save disable, and we've talked extensively about how good things that don't have saving throws are. This will always cost an enemy at least one turn and has the potential to cost them more turns. Forcing enemies to dance is one of the best things that you can do with your 6th level spells, and the characters that can cast this are going to use it to win boss fights very easily. If they fail even one save against this, you've almost certainly just won the encounter outright. But even if they don't fail the save, it forces them to skip a turn, which is incredibly strong against especially bosses. Given that they will often have legendary resistances, there is almost no other way to guarantee disable the high-level bosses in the game. But Auto's Irresistible Dance definitely does it, and that is super valuable. Anything that's 100% reliable is always really, really good. Planar Ally is just a great summon. I think that the Deva is the best of the 3 summons, of the 3 that you have access to. Don't use the Cambion, because the numbers just aren't there. It's just worse than the other 2. The Jinny is also really good, though. But basically, it's just another really good summon. Less utility than the Myrmidons, so I've rated it a little bit lower. And I think that overall, you will prefer Hero's Feast to Planar Ally if you're choosing between the 2, although with ways to refresh your 6th level spells or Hero's Feast from a camp follower, you can use both. And of course it will give you a ton of utility because it's just a summon that does a lot of damage, has a lot of hit points, tanks really well, and has all the great things that summons get in Baldur's Gate. Wall of Frost, or Wall of Ice, is one that was just recently buffed in patch 6, and the reason that this is so good is it is an absurd amount of damage, and it's a big control spell. So it's an upgraded Wall of Stone. You can block off the encounters with it, which is very valuable in and of itself. It creates a gigantic ice surface, and ice surfaces are really good, and it does 10d6 of cold damage when you cast it, which since it's cold damage you can double with the wet condition for 20d6 of cold damage in a big AoE plus an ice surface, which it's already very good. But then if you cancel concentration on this spell, they also take 5d6 damage from the gas when they enter the gas, and then at the start of their turn, the freezing mist or whatever it is. So this spell, if you cast it and then cancel concentration on it immediately, does 20d6 of cold damage, which can be doubled to 40d6 in an AoE, and knocks enemies prone. The description on this spell is misleading. I go into that more in my entry on this spell in particular in the level 6 spells tier list. So if you want more about this spell, definitely check that. But this spell is a ridiculous amount of damage and great utility. This is another one I haven't gotten a chance to use extensively in play because it was just buffed in patch 6. So I could even potentially see this being an S tier spell in future once I've had the time to really get to grips with it and see how good it is in actual play. The amount of damage it does is ridiculous. Finally, Wall of Thorns is an incredible wall spell. It basically combines all the best druid spells, Plant Growth, Entangle, Wall of Fire, etc., all into a single spell, and being able to combine all the best druid spells into one spell is incredible. This is the best thing to keep enemies trapped in, and it keeps enemies trapped in it itself because it entangles enemies that go into it. Other notable spells in this tier include Create Undead, which is good if you are going for a specifically Necromancer build. Sunbeam is a good way to apply Radiating Orb, and Disintegrate is good against enemies that are vulnerable to force damage or that have very low dexterity saves, and you can guarantee the Disintegrate damage to them. Blade Barrier is also useful to keep enemies trapped in, but in general I think you're better off using Wall of Thorns for that purpose. Obviously, they're not on the same character, so you're not always choosing between the two. But if your goal is to build like a sort of microwave strategy where you keep enemies trapped in damaging effects, I would recommend using a druid and taking Wall of Thorns instead of Blade Barrier just because it's not as much damage. Alright, my friends, that has been the look at all of the best spells in Baldur's Gate 3, and several notable ones from outside that tier. I hope that you've enjoyed this and find it useful. I believe that if you just build from the spells that I've mentioned, if you just build your characters and take only the spells that I've mentioned, you will do great you will be totally fine in every game that you play, and your spellcasters will be very powerful. Although, obviously, I encourage you very strongly to experiment with all of the spells in the game, find the ones that you have the most fun with, and of course, different specific characters will have different specific spell needs. For those, you can refer to my more detailed guides, or to the specific guides for character classes, of which I've posted dozens. Overall, though, I think this will give you a great grounding for how to select spells, how to use spells, and which ones are good. And if you believe I've missed anything or misplaced any of these spells, of course let me know in the comments. I'm always interested to see lots of different opinions. I will link all of the previous spell tier lists in the comments as well, so you can go check those out pretty easily. And as always, my friends, if you've enjoyed this video, of course feel free to leave a comment, like the video, and you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and other strategy game guides and analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.